Good morning, good morning. Today, hold on. Had the other system logged into the event, and I was getting a huge echo. Well, welcome to Dynamic Leadership. This is the innovation series, and I have content out there around leadership, sales, and the idea is that we innovate, then we have something to sell, so we have to sell it, and then to scale, we have to lead. So the innovation series will be the ongoing one. And I use a protocol which I'll share today. And if we have people join us on stage, there is a link in the comments that you can click that, and then I can bring you into the studio so we can have a conversation, because it's really about asking the right questions, and it's a facilitated model. Now, by having the interaction, you'll get a sense of what it's like to have the facilitation, to have the conversation about it. It's based on a few principles. So one is, and if you've heard any of my content, you know I kind of repeat this quite a bit, but it's based on human nature. So first of all, dynamic leadership is based on, or is aligned with neuroscience. So it comes out of the self-determination theory. It uses self-determination theory as the foundation, because self-determination theory is the gateway to intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic. So we all know that one is internal, one is external. But what people may not realize is that intrinsic motivation is getting motivation from the activity itself. And it doesn't have to be, quote unquote, a pleasurable activity. The person just has to have the context for why this is important, and then they enjoy it. There's an experiment was done, and they paid these kids $5 an hour to kick a rock around. The rock had to stay moving. As long as the rock kept moving, they would get $5 an hour. If I recall, none of the kids made it for the whole hour. They just gave up and said it's not worth it. But then they created some makeshift nets. This is, just in the city, right? Created some makeshift nets at each end, like goals, and the kids automatically gravitated towards playing with this rock like soccer, and they lasted for hours. Now that's just an example, but it shapes this conversation around, you have to provide the external environment that encourages that intrinsic motivation. And that's why I approach it from the innovation standpoint, because if we're innovating, we are seeking to do something that we're not already doing. When I talk about problem solving, and projects are solutions to, or innovations, right? Projects and innovations are solutions to a problem, either perceived or real. And sometimes they could be a solution to a gap. So both of those are problems. One is what I call a downside problem. One is an upside problem. So the downside problems are a little bit easier because we've been there before. We can see it. There's curbs around it, parameters. We understand what's going on. The upside gaps are a little bit more difficult because we're creating into the field of infinite possibility. And we have so many different options. And we have the added problem of people not wanting to embrace the unfamiliar. There's a lot that's missing when you're going upside. One, you don't have the confirmation. You don't have necessarily support. You don't know if this person who might have been a mentor, or in your mind that they're very important, you don't know if that person is going to agree. There's just so many other factors that have to be addressed. If we don't address those, we find ourselves in a place where we built the thing, we created the solution, but we're not getting any results, we're not getting any engagement. I recall examples where And you've seen this where the system is built in such a way or programmed in such a way that the person has to ask you these questions. We see it sometimes in retail stores where there's a step that you have to go through in order to complete the transaction. And this is for the customer to enter a phone number, maybe it's give information, whatever. And it's very common to see the cashier reach over and click the pad just because they're not engaged. They're not enrolled in that process, or that process is not really aligned with what the customers want. So we have to do that work to figure out what's the frontline staff, their understanding, make sure their understanding is aligned, and then make sure we're not going a bridge too far when it comes to what we're asking the consumer to do. I know people who I've watched them where they just click, 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 click. They're just like, no, 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 yes, yes, no, no. And they just know the sequence. So while they're talking to the person, they're boom, 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 boom. They never ask the questions, but they click the boxes. So we want to avoid that. Now, you just paint a few pictures of this so that we can get aligned. And again, you can click that link and then you join me in the studio so we can have some interaction or just questions, what have you. You may take exception to this. Maybe you have examples of how it's worked for you. Most of these statements people will agree with. And if you don't agree, that's okay, right? You can quickly look it up online. You can do it right now as a search and say what percentage of actions are habitual. Another one would be we make about 33,000 decisions each day. Again, you can look that up. How many decisions do humans make every day on average? And I would refine this by saying 33,000 plus or minus stimulus response cycles. The reason I do this is here's that we have we're awake about 65,000 seconds a day, roughly. It's obviously going to be different for different people. That's about a decision every other second, which is very, very fast. And anyone would tell you they know that they're not making 33,000 decisions a day. Well, that's probably true if you look at it from a conscious standpoint. But what happens is if you have stimulus, within a quarter of a second, there's a reaction. And then, depending on the situation, how wired the person is, how primed they are, what kind of priming is going on, because now you have things like, I'll put it, cognitive biases. You have meta programs. And the short version of a meta program, it's bundling of different associations, neural pathways. So we know that habits are essentially neurons firing and wiring. The ones that fire together wire together, and this is how you end up with habitual patterns, because there's associations that it processes at 11 million bits per second. So there's a processing speed of 11 million bits per second, whereas the conscious mind only has 50 bits per second. And obviously the conscious mind is no match when it comes to that processing speed. The meta programs, when we run something over and over and over, it becomes a bundle of associations that automatically kick off. You might see this happening with a person you're in a conversation, and there's a particular topic comes up, and they're off on and running onto this unrelated rant because it's just a set of associations when people get triggered. And then they do things like automatically. It's like it's an out-of-body experience, like they're out of control. Some of the quote-unquote, the Karen videos that you can see that there's like this track that they're on, and it has nothing to do with reality. And that's a good example of a meta program. It's more complicated than that, but if you get the idea that there's 100 billion neurons and the neural pathways that are related to muscle memory are the same. It's the same system that works with that thinking as what we speak. And there's associations in there. So habits are based on associations, and they're largely from the past. And we have all of that going on. Now, there's two ways that this can go. One, I'll do it. One is that the reaction equals the response. The other way we can go is we can wait a little over a quarter of a second for the conscious mind to catch up. The reason I say a little over a quarter of a second because, and these are averages, so there's going to be plus or minus. I mean, athletes, well-trained athletes have reaction times as low as 150 milliseconds, so just over a tenth of a second. If you're distracted or tired or otherwise compromised, your conscious reaction time could be much more than half a second. This is why they say people speaking on the phone have a reaction time, even if it's hands-free. While driving, they have a reaction time that's comparable to someone who's legally impaired, alcohol impaired. If you let and so the other reason I say a little over a quarter second is because not only do we want the conscious mind to catch up, it only processes at 50 bits per second. So we need it to be able to process a little bit, at least start processing, and then we can have a response. So I'm very much about not letting the reaction become the response. Too often, the reaction is a survival reaction, and survival reactions are based on intense associations from the past, and it's most likely going to be the wrong thing. When you see people getting triggered or they lash out, or you can almost see it, the telling tension comes up, sometimes they just interrupt. Those are survival reactions, and it could be something as simple as when they were 4 years old and they felt threatened, they blurted something out and the threat went away. This is what happens with dogs, right? You see dogs barking. A lot of times they bark like that at people because they found out that, gee, if I bark and growl, I create space because I really don't want these people petting me, and they create some space, and it works. And they may not be mean, aggressive dogs, but if they're doing that, they appear to be mean and aggressive, and eventually maybe the two come together. That's beyond what I want to talk about here. But the point I'm making is that we don't know how these behaviors were learned. What we do know is that we can see them. And I'm painting the picture because if we're doing this 33,000 times a day, this is why I say the stimulus response cycles, we're not even aware of it. This is very similar to driving past an exit on the freeway, and you drive right past your exit, don't even remember driving past the exit. Or you walk into a store and you don't even know why you're in the store. I mean, we have this stimulus reaction to response happening all the time, And what percentage of those, of the 33,000, is here? So if we're here and we're not doing the pause for the response, you can see why we have 95% of our actions are habitual. This leads to, back to what we're talking about today, which is innovation. Now, if you think about how things are so fractal, there's a thing, if you want to understand the macro, study the micro, that kind of thing, but it's very fractal. So the same way that a person's internal system is the external system of the cells, and this is why stress and all this resentment can cause illness, because you're putting your cells in a unhealthy environment, and a cell that's threatened cannot pursue nutrients. So the cell has two configurations. Either it's pursuing nutrients, or it's in protective mode. It doesn't do both. So if you have a toxic environment, you're starving your cells of nutrients, which has obvious downstream effects. Well, similarly, an organization's internal environment is the external environment of the people in it. And if you have toxicity in the environment, which could come from mixed messages, it could come from not listening to people not feeling heard, it could come from perceived threats, perceived transgressions, or real. And if you have toxicity in the internal environment, the external environment of the people is now impacted, and then you have challenges inside. So that's on the negative side. It works on the positive side as well. You want to get more from your people, create positive environments. This is back to the self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. But if we take what we're saying, the 95% is by habit. We got 95% by habit. And we could think of this as people going through. So we have this internal zone, we got this little internal zone. And people go through and they're doing their thing up and down, and sometimes they blip up and they get into this zone above here, and then they come back quickly, and then and sometimes they come down here, and then they come back and they get back into this zone. Well, there's something else that's going on. There's another zone that's up here. And in here, we have reasons we have excuses, we have stories, limiting beliefs, and a limiting belief. I mean, people use that term, they know what a limiting belief is, but you could think of it too as, if I believe that if I do X, Y, and Z, bad things will happen. We may not think of that as a limiting belief because it's not limiting our ability to do something. It's just a complex equivalent that we've said this equals that, and that limits the behavior, and I would call that a limiting belief. So we could just say we have beliefs up there. And you can go on and on. You have the habitual behavior. You have habits. We have incentives and disincentives. And when we have an innovation or a project, we can simplify this and say what we're attempting to do. Now, there's two kinds. As I said, there's projects that have to deal with falling down here, and now we have a problem, and we have to get that fixed. So this is all hands on deck. Let's get it done. This one we've seen, we know what it looks like. We have the parameters. It's a little bit easier to resolve. These are harder because there are a lot of unknown, it's up here, there's a lot of unknown resistance that we have to get through. And as we get into it, as we venture into this, these things show up. Just like I was talking about associations and triggers. We have these reactions and responses and survival reactions, and people are now pushing back simply because they have a belief that says, if I do X, then A will happen. And they don't want A, so therefore they won't do X. And it could be completely false. So we can say that if we are investing money and time in a project, that what we want is to move this up. I'm simplifying it, but hopefully you're tracking with me. And we want to move that up, and we want to have a new set and this means that this is new. These are new behaviors that we need. And this is replace old. These two things have to happen for us to realize what we want to get out of this new project, this change. And so we talk about change management. Too often change management, if you think about a project, and I'll just draw it as a waterfall, even though I know that waterfall projects are not typically the way we're going because of Agile, but just to make the point. So if you have something like design, build, test, implement. I mean, even if you're using Agile, this is happening inside. It's just iterative. So you can do this and keep cycling through because we're actually getting some of the change management done. But the typical way of thinking about change management is we start thinking about it somewhere in here. And I would say that change management needs to start here. And that's why I use the approach that I use. And the one I'm advocating, and this is what I talk about with dynamic leadership on the innovation side. Because if we do this on the innovation side, you're more likely to get the intrinsic motivation. You're more likely to have the change management. Your iterative build process will be much more informed. And you already have figured out what your frontline people are willing to accept. And you've done some testing because that happens in here. You don't build until you've done enough testing of the core beliefs of what you're expecting. And now we know that when we move this up here, we know what is needed new and we know what we need to replace. And then you can have your change management process going along and continually to move up. So you get to your early adopters, you find your mavens, those people who are going to spread the word. You find ways to bring the late adopters, you find ways to bring them in and get some engagement. And you come up with other processes. Maybe people change jobs. Maybe you change the system. I've heard of situations where people change the whole building. They moved the building as part of the reinvention because they had to break some of those old patterns. Sometimes they move and then some people quit. They don't want to move with the organization. Some people quit. I'm not saying that I recommend that or I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that change management is a very difficult endeavor unless you start early. And that's the protocol that I like to use. Now, this is what I wanted to do, where I have some people come up on stage, and if I don't get anybody, it doesn't really make sense to go through it, because I would be just telling you the questions and answering them myself, and it doesn't make sense. It's really about drilling down, like asking, you've heard of 5 whys, ask why 5 times. That's a whole quality, and it works, right? Ask people why 5 times, and one of the things you can do when you're doing that five whys is you're looking at them, and you can see when you've gone beyond what they're accustomed to answer. Once you get beyond what they're accustomed to answer, you're now into the area that they haven't addressed. Most people agree that we want to do this, but there's reasons it hasn't been done before, and we need to figure out what those are, and you want to do it early. This is why I use a facilitated process to do it. The facilitated process enables people to get this information out in a safe environment. Once you get here and it's already being built, it's no longer a safe environment to speak up. When you're just getting information and you're pre-designed, or at least it feels like pre-design, and it should be pre-designed. It's a blend, right? You don't go from pre-design to post-design. You are designing, and part of that designing is overlapping with pre-design and then post-design, and this is where we want to flesh that information out. Yeah, we're at the half-hour mark here, so if I don't have anybody join me in the studio, like I said, we won't. It doesn't really make that much sense to continue on. I'm just checking to make sure the link is working. All right. Feel free to drop some comments in. I will take a look, or you can DM me on LinkedIn or on Facebook, Dynamic Leadership Center, and I'll get back to you. Hopefully this helps. I wanted to paint a picture as to why we have to have a process that takes care of this, and what I have is a repeatable process that you can use over and over and over. I've used it for multi-million-dollar projects. I've used it for small skunk works. It's great for that. It's especially if you use skunk works as a way to test, to decide your design. And I think we should always be testing, especially now with all the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity going on. If you look at just the geopolitical, the geoeconomic, you look at the technology that's changing. So many things are changing so rapidly that status quo is never good enough, because if the markets are continuing to rise and the population is growing, if we're status quo, we're just staying even, it's never been good enough. But I say it's even harder now to not be advancing. It's going to have more impact, more adverse impact, if we're not constantly pushing on that. And the way to push on that is to continue designing and advancing. and then implementing, and that's where the innovation comes in. All right, there you go. We'll see you. I'll do something the third week of July. I'll do another event and see what we get.